Often content online talking about armour focuses on the 15th and 16th centuries, and one of the reasons for this is we've got so much surviving armour, and also it's the period of the HEMA sources, the historical European martial arts treatises that survive to us. But there's one incredibly important century which often gets overlooked for armour development when a lot happened, and that's the 13th century. The magnificent, colourful age of heraldry and tournaments. And here we're going to look at, very quickly, 3 of what I consider to be the most important armour developments that happened during the 13th century. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and once again thanks to all of you who've helped me get me past that 500,000 subscriber mark. I really appreciate it. If you're not subscribed already, please consider doing so. Now this is a 15th century great bassinet, and it's very heavy too, so I'm just going to put that down. Now, as I mentioned, the 13th century is incredibly important, actually not just in Europe, but we are looking at medieval Europe here. So indeed, if we went to China, if we looked at the Mongolian Empire, which is obviously at its rising to its ultimate power in the 13th century, indeed the Mamluks and various other people. So here we're focusing on medieval Europe. So the 13th century, when we start we've just come out of the Third Crusade, haven't we? So we've had the First, Second, Third Crusades. And without going into too much detail, fundamentally, most knights, and that's really what we're focusing on here, the apex of armour at this time, most knights in the Third Crusade really weren't equipped very differently to the Norman knights that you see on the Bayeux Tapestry. They had mail shirts, long-sleeved mail hauberks, mail on their legs as well by this point, and most of them actually had conical open-faced helmets. The first thing that we're going to look at that is really important, I'm going to look at the 3 most important things that I consider in armour development in the 13th century, is something that appeared right at the end, really in the kind of 1180s, 1190s. So it was already around before we get into the 13th century. But really I would say that the 13th century was the century of the Great Helm. That's right. So a lot of you will think of the Great Helm as the archetypal Crusader helmet, but ironically, the First, Second and Third Crusades, the kind of most famous Crusades, of course there were Crusades after that, but the first 3 Crusades were done largely in open-faced conical helmets, not very different really to what was being worn at the time of the Norman conquest. Now, admittedly, the Great Helm for some knights had started to come about and was worn by some, a form of it, an early form of it, in the Third Crusade, so in the 1190s, okay? But as we get into the 13th century, so more or less between 1200 and 1300, the Great Helm really starts to come into its own and become really prevalent and really common. So the first thing I want you to know about is the Great Helm. And this is the ultimate knightly helmet of the 13th century. And it starts off at the beginning of the 13th century being something which is a little bit longer at the front and shorter at the back and more or less flat topped. So quite a simple shape. And across the 13th century it develops. It develops in various forms and starts to become a little bit barreled. And even by the end it even becomes pointed on top, which obviously corresponds to the development of the helmet that was underneath it, known as the bassinet. Now, in case you didn't know, when you see those Crusaders, they're actually for the most part 13th century looking knights, which admittedly could be one of the later Crusades. The great bassinet isn't just over someone's head. First of all, you have the mail coif, okay? So knights at this time are wearing head to foot mail, and that they had been doing in the 12th century. So that isn't one of the pieces of armour that was new. That was really something that had already been developed in the 11th and 12th century. We have got full-length sleeves with mail mittens. We'll talk about the hands and arms in a second. We've got a full-length shirt going down to pretty much the knees, and then you've got chausses, as they're called, or mail chausses, which are essentially mail, chainmail, leggings underneath that as well. So they're completely head-to-foot mail. You don't, generally speaking, just put the Great Helm straight over the coif, which is the kind of hood that comes around the head. There is also either padding or a plate known as a cervellia, and the cervellia plate develops into the later bassinet. We won't go into that now, underneath. So the great helm is part of a system. The great helm can be worn in the charge, or it can be worn in close combat, but if you pull it off, you've still got the mail coif, you've still got some padding and or a plate cervellia usually underneath that as well. So it's a full head protection system, and the 13th century is really the century in which the great helm and bassinet or cervellia system comes into being and continues in use for a lot of the 14th century as well. So the 13th century, the first thing I want to focus on is the great helm. Now the second thing, which is incredibly important to armour development, which comes about in the 13th century, as far as we know, because we can't see it in art, is something called the coat of plates. Now the coat of plates is pretty much what it sounds like. It is a series of plates which are worn under a coat, essentially, so under fabric and or leather. So essentially what you have is a fabric garment, organic material garment, which has plates riveted to it. Now, we know the designs of some of these. For example, the statue of St. Maurice shows one in the kind of middle of the 13th century. So we know what some of them look like. But here's the problem. We don't know an awful lot about the variety of coats of plate in the 13th century when they first started to appear and start to become more common, because they're hidden underneath the surcoat. The surcoat is the heraldic clothing worn over the mail, something which comes about during the first three crusades, actually. And so by the third crusade in the 1190s, knights commonly wear their heraldic surcoat over the top of the mail. And the problem is that hides what's on their torso. Now, in many cases, we know they were just wearing mail underneath and they didn't have anything else. But by the middle of the 13th century, certainly by around 1240, 1250, we find written records and we start to see glimpses in art, both statues and carvings on church walls and things like this, and also things like manuscript and frescoes and stuff like this, that start to hint at the existence of something called plates, sometimes known as pair of plates, which probably means front and back, or it could mean two on the front, or the coat of plates. So fundamentally, this is the reason it's so important is because it's a massive step forward in protectiveness, and it's the beginnings of plate armour. It's the beginnings of the cuirass that becomes the full-plated armour of the next century, in the 14th century. So the coat of plates, where did it come from? What inspired it? We don't know. It could have been contact with the Middle East. It could have been contact with the Mongols. It could have been contact with the Mamluks or various other people. And in fact, there are some early mentions at the end of the 1100s of breastplates, but we know they weren't wearing breastplates as we think of them, so there might have been early adoption of a plate worn in addition to the mail to give it a bit more chest protection right at the end of the 12th century, and then in the 13th century that developed more and more and more, such that by the end of the 13th century the coat of plates seems to have been pretty much universal. And the third and final thing which came about in the latter part of the 13th century, so we're talking here around 1270, 1280s, we start to see something on effigies, for example, on tombs, and also in manuscript art, and it is the first other bit of plate armour that we can actually see, and it's on the knees. Now, anybody who's ever been hit hard in the knee will know that it can be a life-changing incident. And clearly, if you're sitting on horseback, which obviously knights spent a lot of time doing, your knee is extremely vulnerable. Not to say other bits aren't vulnerable as well, but the knee is incredibly critical, and really, they didn't really have any surgical ways of fixing the knee if it got broken. If you've ever looked at a polo game, you'll notice they wear protection on their knees. You look at skateboarders, like kids learning to skateboard and all sorts of sports, they wear knee protection. Knee protection is incredibly important, and therefore, presumably for that reason, it was one of the first bits of limb plate armour, in fact the first piece of limb plate armour really to start appearing at this time in the medieval period. So, it's also incredibly important because from the knee protection, although it's the first one that starts to appear with any regularity, by the very end, by about 1300, we start to see the first plates occasionally, very rarely by this point. It becomes more common as we get into the 14th century. But right at the end, like very end of the 13th century, we start to see occasionally things for the shins and things for the arms. But this really is something that becomes common in the 14th century. So by the end of the 13th century, really, we're still dealing with a knight who is covered head to foot and still with mittens of mail. We don't really have plate gauntlets by this point yet, maybe the very earliest forms of them by the year 1300. But by and large, most people have still got mail mittens, full-length mail sleeves and mail legs, mail shirts, mail coif. But they've got the great helm over a Sevelier. They have a coat of plates on their torso, hidden underneath the surcoat. And on their knees, very often, not always in fact, but very often on their knees, they have the first plates, which are starting to become popular. So there we go. The 13th century is, I think, a very underappreciated century for arms and armour aficionados. We all get fixated on these lovely things from later centuries when they become a bit more developed. But really the 13th century is pivotal and critical. And of course in history terms it's incredibly interesting. You know, you've got the Mongols, you've got everything going on down with the Genoese and the Venetians and the Mamluks and various other people. You've got Edward I, you've got the conquest of Wales and Scotland and this kind of stuff. Wars in France, hugely interesting period. So please give the 13th century a little bit more love and maybe pay a bit more attention to the incredibly important developments that happened to armour in the 13th century. So hopefully you've learned something from this video. Did you know all of this? Do you think there's any other things that developed in the 13th century that I should have mentioned? Get posting down below. Hope I'll see you back soon for another video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!